The paper is Ethics 2. The module is Critique of Morality. I'm Akash Singh Rathore from the Lewis University of Rome. The objectives of this module will be to understand the critique of morality, primarily Nietzsche's, from the Western tradition. Within the Western philosophical tradition, the critique of morality goes back to the very origins of philosophizing about morality. The dialogues of Plato take up questions about virtue and vice, right and wrong, justice and injustice, seeking always to defend the virtuous, the right, and the just. That is, seeking always to defend morality. The Sophists, early Greek philosophers for hire, were deeply critical of conventional morality. And in Plato's Republic, certain Sophists were present in order to critique the morality that Plato was attempting to defend. A notable modern philosopher who counts as a radical critic of morality is the 18th century philosopher from Scotland, David Hume. In the 19th century, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was by far the most paradigmatic critic of morality. And in this module, we'll be focusing primarily on Nietzsche's thought. In the 20th century, the French philosopher Michel Foucault is often interpreted as the forefront critic of conventional morality. We'll begin with the Sophists. Protagoras authored a book entitled On Truths, which begins, "Of all things, man is the measure. Of things that are, that they are. Of things that are not, that they are not." Normally we attribute to Protagoras simply the phrase, "Man is the measure of all things." In being the measure of all things, man is obviously the measure not only of truth, what is real, and what is not real, but also what is good, what is the right thing to do, what is the wrong thing to do. This is a completely relativistic understanding, and in that sense represents an early critique of the universal ideas of morality. Another sophist, Antiphon, argued that irrespective of what moralists or lawmakers command, there are laws which nature herself imposes, and the primary one of these is the law of self-preservation. Another sophist, Callicles, whom influenced Nietzsche, the German philosopher Nietzsche, quite a lot, taught that conventional morality is a ploy, a trick used by the many weak against the strong few. So it was a tool for control by the crowd against those who are referred to as the aristoi, or the elite or the best. The way to control the elite or the best from taking advantage of the crowd is to impose morality. The real principle of morality for Callicles, just as for Antiphon, is the law of nature, which means self-preservation. So both for Callicles and Antiphon, nature and convention are deeply at odds. Another prominent critique of morality, in fact, within the history of Western philosophy, one of the most famous critiques of morality occurs in Plato's Republic. Plato's dialogue, The Republic, seeks to defend morality. It seeks to defend the just, the right, and the good. But in the process of defending it, it has to encounter attacks against the conception that Socrates and Plato want to put forward. In the Republic, the sophist Thrasymachus appears. The name Thrasymachus is interesting because the root word is mache, which means to make war. And Thrasymachus is described by Plato as being very violent and having a ruddy complexion that gets so full of blood that Socrates actually steps back in fear. The sophist Thrasymachus ridicules Socrates' attempt to establish justice, and he puts forward a critique, a very radical critique that we hear in other sophists like Callicles and Antiphon. Thrasymachus says, "I posit that the just is no other than the advantage of the stronger." To conceive of justice, which is a sovereign virtue, a cardinal virtue, as nothing other than advantage over the other, which is to say, seeking advantage of the over the other, self-interest, like Callicles and Antiphon said, or the fact that some have natural advantage over the other, is a very thoroughgoing critique of our normal sense of morality, which postulates the just, the right, equilibrium, harmony, and other democratic values. Socrates attempts to refute Thrasymachus, but in the process, the argument becomes quite heated, and Socrates has to take some time to cool off. And in Plato's representation of this battle between the just and the sophistic argument that the just is nothing but advantage and seeking advantage, Plato's representation of this is supposed to, in itself, teach us something about the nature of morality. The equanimity with which the Socratic position finally overcomes the Thrasymachus position is supposed to serve as some sort of a lesson against the sophistical critique of morality. This comes out in one passage or expression of Socrates that has become quite famous. He says, "There must even be justice amongst thieves." In other words, justice must be the supervening virtue over seeking advantage, over self-interest, over exploitation and power, because even those with whom you band together to seek advantage requires a certain kind of justice or compromise. If two thieves get together to rob another man, they must at least establish certain principles of justice, or it becomes total anarchy. Socrates' response to Thrasymachus, that justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger, then relies on a prior condition than the sophistical claim that we are seeking always and forever our self-interest. And in this respect, Socrates refutes the critique of morality, and Plato, through the dialogue, attempts to suggest that the moral position is somehow superior than the critique of morality. Another interlocutor in Plato's dialogue, an interlocutor is one of the characters who appears in the dialogue, is Glaucon. Now, Glaucon is not a sophist. In fact, in historical terms, he was Plato's own brother. He appears in the dialogue as a student of Socrates, someone who agrees with Socrates and wants to learn from him, but is nevertheless surrounded by the intelligentsia, the critics and the skeptics, who are always posing very difficult questions. So he wants to pose his own critique of morality towards Socrates in order to hear what Socrates' response is, so he's empowered to give a reply to the sophists. Glaucon states that while he doesn't believe this, many people say that justice is in fact just a necessary evil. It's not a good in itself. It's a necessary evil that we must suffer for the rewards that it brings. And this fits in quite well with Socrates' reply to Thrasymachus that there must even be justice amongst thieves. Just because there's justice amongst thieves doesn't mean that justice is a good in itself. As Glaucon has pointed out, justice can just be a temporary measure for the pursuit of more self-aggrandizement and more self-enrichment and more power over others. The whole point behind Plato's Republic is to establish that these critiques of morality are short-sighted and self-defeating. Glaucon's argument is defeated by Socrates, not in one line or through just a few passages, but the whole rest of the Republic, when Socrates decides that he needs to make an analogy between the city and the soul. Because justice in the city is similar to justice in the soul. And just as the city is divided in various parts, so too the soul. If we look at the soul of a human being and the components within it, we don't need to get into the specific components, but it's self-evident that if within the soul one side is always trying to pursue power over the other or regain control over the other elements of the soul, then we have a disharmonious condition which could, of course, lead to psychological problems. So considering that the soul requires a certain amount of harmony and not just the pursuit of advantage of one aspect of the soul, so too the city cannot be grounded on a conception of justice which is assuming the priorities and privileges of one aspect of the city over another. So there's this argument about harmony and the analogy between the soul and the city, which is used by Socrates ultimately to refute not just Thrasymachus, but also Glaucon and all of the other critiques of morality which appear within the Republic. Nevertheless, the fact that Plato spends so much time with the critique of morality in the attempt to present the ideals of morality show us that the critique is a constant presence among the defense of morality in the Western tradition. Also, small hints or indications that Plato puts into the language and the names of the interlocutors, as I had mentioned, Thrasymachus, which means making war, suggests that there are a number of problems within the affirmative view of morality that are never fully addressed in the defense of morality. Some of those problems are thematic and conceptual, and interestingly, some of them are philological. From this philological understanding of the terms that we commonly associate with moral philosophy and ethics, we get a sense of the real nature of the origins of our moral thinking. Quite contrary to the democratic and universalistic understanding that we will find later in philosophers like Kant, or also Mill, in the utilitarianism of Mill. In this philological understanding of the origins of our words and thinking and discussing moral philosophy and ethics, we find a inegalitarian, aristocratic, hierarchy-based conception of the nature of things. That conception of the nature of things was shared by the Sophists, and it was very prominent in Plato and in Aristotle's time. Even when the Greek advocates of moral and ethical thinking, like Plato and Aristotle, or critics of moral and ethical thinking, like the Sophists, were struggling with these terms, the defenders of moral and ethical thinking in the Greek world were nevertheless preoccupied with the way in which the terms that we use to discuss moral and ethical philosophy are grounded in very elitist and hierarchical conceptions and words. The order of things in pre-modern times was, of course, hierarchy. So how do you determine what is the right or the good? It's always reflected through those hierarchies. What do the best people do? That is what it's good to do. When we move to modern times, we enter an era where egalitarianism and universal equality, capacities of the human person are considered shared. For example, the capacity to reason, which will become important in Kant's moral philosophy, or the fact that we all feel and pursue pleasure and pain, which becomes very prominent in consequentialist moral philosophy. This universalization of the grounds of moral thinking runs quite contrary to the hierarchy of pre-modernity. As we move into modernity, we have once again philosophers who are promoting and advocating for the universality and truth of morality, and concomitantly its critics. by far the most controversial and comprehensive critic of morality in modern times is the great German philosopher of the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's critique of morality was manifold, and it had different attacks for every sort of moral tradition. The Kantian tradition, based in reason, so grounding moral law in man's rationality, was criticized by Nietzsche extensively. But one of the most fundamental critiques that he made was that Kant assumes that we know why we are acting. Now, Nietzsche, as a psychologist, and interestingly, Freud, the great psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, was a devout student of Nietzsche and referred to him as his greatest teacher in psychology. Nietzsche put forward a psychological critique of the Kantian moral philosophy grounded in rationality, which was that to assume that human beings are indeed rational or have access to reason is to make an illicit assumption that none of us has the right to make. Which person really knows the grounds of his action? Which person really knows why he does what he does? In fact, we often find that it's only others who know why we do what we do. If that's true, then grounding moral obligation in reason is tenuous at best, given the fragility of human psychology. In terms of consequentialist moral thinking, a rival to the deontological moral philosophy of Kant grounded in reason, you have a moral thought grounded in the consequences of your action. In other words, whether they should bring happiness or pleasure to a greater number of people, including oneself, or whether the action should lead to reducing the pleasure and happiness of the greater number of people, including yourself. Nietzsche's argument is that just as we don't know the reasons for our action, we also have no idea about the consequences of our action. How is it possible that we can predict the future in such a way that we would know how to regulate or moderate our behavior in the present? So if consequentialist moral thinking is grounded in producing results, the consequences, Nietzsche's basic and very decisive critique is, how can we ever know? In fact, it may turn out that doing the thing that we are most advised not to do, that we're told is the worst possible thing to do from the moral point of view, in fact brings about the best possible results. And in that respect, grounding moral philosophy in consequences is as untenable, according to Nietzsche, as it is in grounding it in rationality. So Nietzsche critiques two very dominant moral approaches, the deontological or Kantian and the consequentialist, or the greatest spokesman for which is Mill and utilitarian. An interesting aspect of the critique of morality occurs not as a philosophical critique, but as a philological critique. That is, to understand the origin and genealogy, the derivation of the words that we use commonly within moral philosophy, and to expose that if you actually look at the origin of the words, they tend to support some of the critiques of morality put forward, for example, by the Sophists or by Nietzsche, the German philosopher Nietzsche in the 19th century. Take, for example, the Greek word arete, or virtue. The word arete derives out of the Proto-Indo-European root ar. Now, ar in the Proto-Indo-European languages, Greek, Sanskrit, Latin, ancient Persian, represents bellicosity or a relationship to war. In fact, the English word war comes directly from ar. It just has the W in front of the AR. That W sound, which was va in ancient Greek, dropped out over time. So when we look at arete and we see that it derives from this root phoneme or sound ar, and observe that the word war in English derives directly from it, or within the Greek pantheon of gods, the god of war, Ares, you see that the root word ar is closely lined up to the idea of making war or of bellicosity. Now, how can it be that our word for virtue or excellence, arete, is deeply embedded with this notion of warlike, making war, and bellicosity? So the terms war and man, in its sense in Latin as vir, which also appears in Hindi as courageousness, or ver, as we have in the word werewolf, meaning man-wolf. This vir, or virtue, are also fundamentally related, as are arete and Ares. So in both the root word for arete, or virtue in the Greek language, and virtue itself in Latin, we have an etymological grounding in the concept of manliness, courage, war-making, and bellicosity in the Western tradition. In fact, in the Indian tradition, there's also a linkage of righteous conduct, arya, morality from the Vedic text, artha, and at least tenuously, dharma, to some fundamental idea of bellicosity by means of the same derivation, because these languages are all related. They're all Indo-European languages. So Arya, Aryan, is also grounded in this ar, this bellicose, as is Aristos, or the best, the aristocracy. So what the philological critique attempts to do is to show that the very words that we use to represent moral perfection or moral ideas are actually grounded in warlike concepts of masculinity, domination, and bellicosity. It's intriguing to think of the Bhagavad Gita in this respect, because we know that it's a battlefield epic poem teaching us the ideals of human perfection. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche linked the bellicose master morality, if you can call it that, the arete, arestu, the virtue of the best, the virtue of the most noble. The terms arete, virtue in Greek, Ares, the god of war, and ariston, the best sort of person. Nietzsche, being a great philologist, was also quite comfortable in Sanskrit. He linked Arya and Artha from the Vedas, and from the Persian, the Arya, where we get the name Iranian, for example, what is in Avestan or the Persian language, noble. All of these concepts of morality are derived from the Proto-Indo-European root ar, which again is the origin of the English word war. So this brings us to Nietzsche's critique of morality. When Nietzsche had firmly established philologically that our ideas of morality are indeed somehow grounded in the very critiques that the Sophists had made about morality, that we consider it in some way natural and objective, when in fact it is a convention imposed to cloud or cover over the real state of things, which is that the best, the aristoi, are pursuing their own perfection, arete, and in the process, they don't really care about the many or the people, hoi polloi, or the demos. Nietzsche extended this basic philological understanding into also conceptual critiques of morality. If you take the Kantian imperative, the moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant, which tells us to act as if, in other words, to treat all people as an end in themselves and not merely as a means, to universalize your thoughts in order to generate what it is that ought to be done. If we take these basic universalist approach to morality, then, according to Nietzsche, it's doomed, because human beings don't really know why they act. This is one of Nietzsche's first critiques after the philological one, which is a psychological one. Human beings are not entirely sure why they do what they do. And if that's the case, how is it that we can ground the universality of morality in the reasons about doing what we do? Another critique that Nietzsche made against dominant ideas in moral philosophy was a critique against consequentialism. So if you take the Nietzschean critique against deontological moral thinking, which is grounded in rationality, Nietzsche's critique is that rationality is at best tenuous and we're not necessarily connected to our reasons. He then moves on to a critique of consequential moral philosophy, what we can consider in some respects a utilitarian, or in Nietzsche's own times, the suggestion to do good for the consequences that it necessarily entails, and to avoid doing wrong because of the bad consequences that necessarily arise. Nietzsche again says we don't really know the full consequences of any act. In fact, it may be that if I do something quite heinous in the eyes of those around me, the consequences may be far better than if I were to impose the social standard and do what, according to the social standard, I was supposed to do. As we're unable to know the consequences of any act, the consequentialist imperative to do good in order to bring about good effects is faulty, as it suggests that we have an adequate knowledge of the future that we don't have. Nietzsche was also quite deterministic. There was a doubt about whether human beings are free to act the way that they would want to act, rather than how they're biologically determined to act. So there's something of a determinist strain in Nietzsche's thought. It's ambiguous, but it's presented at certain moments, and assuming that we were determined, then the idea that we could choose to do what is right over what is wrong becomes ridiculous. Nietzsche's critique of morality was not merely destructive. He spoke about philosophizing with a hammer and shattering idols and things like that, but this was not a purely destructive act. One wonders, reflecting back on the Sophists, whether there was anything constructive about the Sophist critique of morality. But with Nietzsche, there's certainly a constructive aspect to his critique of morality. The primary point of Nietzsche's undermining of morality is in order to offer a fresh ground for a new ethical flourishing. And Nietzsche wrote quite a lot about what happens after you've demolished conventional morality. Nietzsche's call is for those very few who are capable to sacrifice the present for the sake of a philosophy of the future. Now, morality tells us what to do here and now. Nietzsche says we have to overcome that morality in order to open up the horizon for new possibilities in the future. In this respect, Nietzsche seeks a new sort of man. He calls it the overman. It's the Übermensch. It's commonly translated as the Superman. That man who transvalues or rises over and above the values of his day. He projects himself into the possibilities of the future to see what the future may bring. This sounds somewhat radical and even violent, but when you consider it in terms of the cowardly complacency that most of us who follow the moral dictates of the day, the cowardly complacency with which we act, we realize that bringing about new forms or new, more promising forms of moral behavior is precluded or excluded by a constant following of the moral dictates of the time. So Nietzsche's basic premise is that we all follow the morality that we've inherited. In following the morality that we've inherited, we're sacrificing the possibilities of the future to a stale past, because this morality is inherited. In order to explore and open up the possibilities of the future, we have to destroy the morality that we've inherited. So there is a positive element. Where that positive element can lead is, of course, open to question. In conclusion, the critique of morality has been present ever since the dawn of the advocacy of morality. So just as you have Plato's Republic, which advocates a moral and just life, nestled within it are, of course, critiques of morality. There are vexing challenges to the basic question, why should I be moral? Philosophers from Aristotle to Kant to Mill, in other words, virtue ethics in Aristotle, the deontological ethics in Kant, or consequentialist ethics in Mill, and so many others, believe that they've offered compelling answers to the question, why should I be moral? As we've discussed, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche rejected all of those answers systematically. His aim behind this destruction was intended to be positive. The outcome remains ambiguous. Thank you.